This episode of the Royal Ramble is dedicated to the memory of Scott Hall. Hey yo, hard work pays off, dreams come true, bad times don't last, but bad guys do. Those were the immortal words of one Scott Hall to close out his 2014 WWE Hall of Fame acceptance speech, words that will undoubtedly continue living on through wrestling fans worldwide forever and ever. You know the WWE always starts their broadcasts with the words now, then, forever. And it's moments like these that I think give fans a deeper understanding and appreciation for those words than perhaps ever before. As fans, we often feel as if we grew up with these wrestlers, our heroes, and we almost feel as if we're part of their inner circle, their family. So it definitely hits close to home when one of those wrestling family members passes on. He was born Scott Oliver Hall on October 20th, 1958 in St. Mary's County, Maryland. Born and raised in a military family, Hall had to move once every year before he was 15 years old and attended high school in Munich, Germany. His pro wrestling journey didn't begin until 1984, the very year that this podcaster was born. And that further emphasizes my earlier point that as a wrestling fan, I feel like I grew up with Scott Hall, the wrestler. He was about 25 or 26 years old, which may be considered rather old by wrestling standards, but he didn't let that deter him. He was focused and determined to carry on and become one of the biggest names in the history of pro wrestling, which I'm sure we can all agree that he did. Hall got his start in the NWA's Florida territory, Championship Wrestling from Florida, and his first feud was with a man who became one of the major inspirations of Hall's wrestling career, Dusty Rhodes. Hall would soon team up with the Golden Boy Dan Spivey, Golden Boy with his WWE moniker. He was also known as Waylon Mercy later on, a gimmick inspired by Robert De Niro's Max Cady character in Cape Fear. Hall had his own experience playing a movie-inspired gimmick, and I'll get to that a little later on. Hall and Spivey went on to work in Jim Crockett's Charlotte, North Carolina territory and were known by the team name of American Starship. Hall under the name of Starship Coyote, and Spivey under the name Starship Eagle. The team didn't wrestle very often and were mostly utilized as part of the ground crew for the Charlotte Orioles, a minor league baseball team that Crockett owned at the time. But it was very common in those days, and still is in a lot of ways, for rookies of the business to pay their dues, so to speak, before being thrown directly into the lion's den. When they did wrestle, they weren't very successful. The highlight of their careers up until that point was in a losing effort in a tag match to Arn and Ole Anderson, otherwise known as the Minnesota Wrecking Crew, in Crockett's Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling, and that match was actually for the Andersons' national tag team titles, so even in defeat, it was still a pretty major accomplishment for rookies Hall and Spivey. About a year later, the team moved on to Bob Geigel's NWA Central States territory in Atlantic City. Here they earned a shot at NWA Central States Tag Team Champions Marty Jannetty, yes, that Marty Jannetty, and Bulldog Bob Brown. It was another losing effort, but yet another championship match within a year in the business, so nothing to sneeze at. A short while later, American Starship was split up, as Spivey returned to the Carolinas under Crockett, while Hall remained in the Central States, both focusing on singles runs. Hall joined the AWA in 1985, wrestling under the name Magnum Scott Hall initially, and later Big Scott Hall. He was a babyface or good guy at the time, and promoter Vern Gagne apparently saw big things in Hall's future, even intending to push him toward the same success he had with Hulk Hogan, and especially following Hogan's departure to rival WWF. While wrestling for Gagne's AWA, Hall also wrestled several tours for New Japan Pro Wrestling between 1987 and 1990. Back in the States, Hall developed a partnership with his more experienced friend Kurt Hennig, and went on to greater success than he had ever achieved before. The team captured the AWA World Tag Team Championships on January 18, 1986 from Steve Regal, and no, not the Steve Regal you're probably thinking of, and Jimmy Garvin in a match that went nearly an hour in Albuquerque, New Mexico. They had a pretty impressive run, eventually losing the straps to the team of Doug Summers and Buddy Rose on a countout, which, as many of you know, is a very unusual and non-traditional way for titles to change hands. But that was the stipulation at the time. Once they lost the belts, the team disbanded. Hall's star was seemingly on the rise, challenging for the AWA World Championship on a few occasions against the likes of Stan Hansen and Rick Martel. Gagne's plan was to put the belt on Hall, but Hall apparently wasn't so much a fan of the colder temperatures in the territory, and it's been reported that he allegedly felt at the time that the AWA was a sinking ship and thus signed on with the National Wrestling Alliance in 1989. Hall was brought into the territory by Jim Ross as part of a new talent initiative that WCW was focused on at the time. They wanted to develop new young stars, also including Brian Pillman and Sid Vicious. Hall made his debut on the June 3rd edition of what later became WCW Saturday Night, but was then just simply known as World Championship Wrestling. He was initially known as Scott Gator Hall, and they aired a series of vignettes prior to his on-screen debut, which showed him swimming, playing volleyball at the beach, riding boats, fishing, and scaring alligators. Needless to say, the gimmick didn't really catch on. His in-ring debut came a couple weeks later at a house show in Cleveland, where he teamed with Randy Rose, formerly of the Midnight Express, in a losing effort against then World Tag Team Champions, the Fabulous Freebirds. Hall's first victory in the promotion came later that month over a guy named Rip Morgan in Salisbury, Maryland, and then engaged in a successful house show feud with Bill Irwin. He made his TV debut on the July 9th edition of World Championship Wrestling, being pinned by the legendary Great Muta, and was also defeated by Terry Funk on an episode of WCW Pro airing that very same day. At the 1989 Great American Bash, he made his pay-per-view debut as one of the participants in the King of the Hill Battle Royal, and following that match, he then hit a bump in the road and started jobbing regularly on television and house shows to some of the bigger stars of the promotion, eventually leading to a hiatus from regular competition. Hall returned to New Japan Pro Wrestling in 1990 in an effort to perfect his craft and further enhance his in-ring ability. In doing so, he wrestled several tours against a very diverse group of opponents, including Bam Bam Bigelow, Koji Katao, Nord the Barbarian, later known as the Berserker in the WWF, and Shinya Hashimoto. 1990 was also the year that Hall married his first wife, Dana Lee Bergio. At the end of 1990, he wrestled briefly for Catch Wrestling Association under the name Texas Scott, and also had a brief stint in the Puerto Rico-based promotion World Wrestling Council, defeating Miguel Perez Jr. for the Caribbean Heavyweight Championship, only to lose to Super Medic 3, also known as Jose Estrada Jr. In 1991, Hall and his wife gave birth to their first child, a son named Cody, who also became a wrestler. Hall's return to WCW in 91 was moderately successful. This was around the time that I first started to become familiar with Scott Hall as a wrestler. I had a more casual viewing relationship with WCW, which had just purchased the NWA once Hall was brought in. It was a little too mature of a program for my liking, as I was used to the more cartoony type storylines and characters of the WWF. But I knew that this other wrestling company existed, and some of my cousins and uncles who were much older than I was would often watch WCW in favor of WWF, so I became familiar with some of the regular characters and storylines as a result. If I'm being honest, my first impression of Scott Hall wasn't great. I knew him at the time as the character the Diamond Stud, wrestling under the tutelage of one Diamond Dallas Page as part of a group known as the Diamond Exchange. At first glance, I just thought he was a generic big man, and honestly, I didn't even think he was that big at the time by wrestling standards. There wasn't really much that stood out about his character at the time, and I couldn't even pick him out of a lineup. To me, he just seemed like an average worker who was more or less a jobber to the stars. But then I was 5 or 6 years old, so what did I know? Hall sustained an injury that kept him out of action from the end of 91 until early 92, when he would form short-lived tag teams with guys like Vinny Vegas, otherwise known as Kevin Nash, and Scotty Flamingo, later known as Raven. The three were part of a stable at the time called the Diamond Mine, well, the original Diamond Mine. Hall also occasionally teamed up with members of Paulie Dangerously's Dangerous Alliance, and it was contemplated at one time about Hall joining the group, but it never came to fruition, and Hall left WCW shortly afterwards. His final televised match was on May 8, 1992 against Ron Campbell. This might be an unknown fact to the vast majority of wrestling fans, but prior to entering the WWF in 1992, Scott Hall actually did receive a few tryouts years earlier. He wrestled on house shows in 1987 and 1990, but was not signed at the time. Most people listening to this will probably be most familiar with Hall's run as Razor Ramon in the WWF. This was the character that launched his career. I mentioned movie-inspired characters earlier, and I don't think it's any secret that Hall's Razor Ramon gimmick was inspired by Al Pacino's character Tony Montana in Scarface, and I think Hall played the character expertly. It didn't even feel like a character. It felt like this was his actual real-life persona, and this is how all wrestling characters, in my view, should feel. There needs to be a huge degree of believability there, because there will otherwise be a disconnect between the wrestler and the audience. And I think Hall did such a tremendous job of portraying the character that is the one that he's most associated with. In fact, WWE even inducted him into the 2014 Hall of Fame not as Scott Hall but as Razor Ramon. That is incredible. Hall apparently pitched the character in a meeting with Vince McMahon and Pat Patterson as a joke, even quoting lines from the movie with a fake Cuban accent. Hall later discovered that neither McMahon nor Patterson had ever seen or heard of the movie, but that his ideas were genius, believing that Hall was coming up with these ideas for the character himself. McMahon and Patterson came up with the name Razor, but agreed with Hall's suggestion that it should be just a nickname, and that he would need to come up with a proper name. Hall turned to Tito Santana for help in coming up with a Latino-sounding name that started with an R to accompany the name Razor, and it was Santana who apparently first suggested the name Ramon. Hall brought that name back to McMahon, who approved, and the rest was history. The Razor Ramon logo and costume were designed by a gentleman named Tom Fleming. Razor Ramon made his in-ring debut on the August 8, 1992 episode of WWF Superstars against a man named Paul Van Dale, who was the father of current WWE superstar Leah Van Dale, otherwise known as Carmella. This is a major historical fact in my opinion, and someone had posted this in the SNME radio group, which came as quite a shock to me because I didn't even realize that Carmella was second generation. The Razor Ramon character quickly took off. Pretty soon, almost everyone in the audience either had a toothpick in their mouth or their hair slicked back. As a young fan at the time, I would often get made fun of for liking pro wrestling. It wasn't considered very cool at the time. The argument that most people like to use is that it's fake fighting, and yeah, it is in a lot of ways, but so are the movies that those same people enjoy. But there were certain characters that people who didn't follow wrestling regularly did accept as cool, and one of those characters was Razor Ramon. He received an almost immediate push, being paired with Ric Flair for a tag team match against Randy Savage and the Ultimate Warrior at Survivor Series 1992. This was a huge deal for Hall to be in the ring with three of the top stars in the entire industry. A couple weeks prior to the event, Warrior was fired by the company and replaced by Flair's former executive consultant, Mr. Perfect, who made his in-ring return as a babyface. The match ended via disqualification, but Hall's push wouldn't end. In fact, he received his first WWF World Title match at the following pay-per-view, the Royal Rumble, against Bret the Hitman Hart. Hall lost the match, but it is to this day highly regarded as one of his greatest matches of all time. Hall's first WrestleMania was WrestleMania 9 in Vegas. It wasn't one of the most featured bouts on the card, but it was against another former WWF champion, Bob Backlund, whom Hall defeated. On the May 17, 1993 episode of Monday Night Raw, Hall started a feud with a guy known simply as The Kid. Sean Waltman was a notorious jobber at the time, but to the surprise of everyone, he won this match in a huge upset. Hall and The Kid later became good friends as members of the Clique, and The Kid went on to more success as the 1-2-3 Kid and later X-Pac. Many of the other heels at the time started poking fun at Hall's loss to the youngster, including the team of Money Incorporated, comprised of Ted DiBiase Sr. and Irwin R. Shyster, also known as Mike Rotunda. This eventually led to Razor Ramon's babyface push, starting with a singles victory over DiBiase at that year's SummerSlam, which ended up being DiBiase's final match ever. Hall's run of success continued as he captured his first singles championship in the WWF, defeating Rick Martel to win the vacant Intercontinental title that had been stripped of Shawn Michaels due to suspension. Once Michaels returned, he and Razor started a feud to determine who is the rightful Intercontinental Champion, culminating in the first televised ladder match between the two at WrestleMania 10, another match highly regarded as one of the best ever. Most fans have called it the best ladder matches of all time, and I would say that some might even argue that it was the best match either of these guys have ever had, and all things considered, that really says a lot. From there, Razor would move on to other feuds over the Intercontinental title with guys such as Michaels' bodyguard Diesel, also known as Kevin Nash, and later Jeff Jarrett. Actually, when Razor defeated Diesel for his second Intercontinental title at SummerSlam 94, he was accompanied by former Chicago Bears running back Walter Payton, which I'm sure was a huge honor for both himself and Payton at the time. This wasn't even Hall's only celebrity encounter. He and a number of others participated in a WrestleMania 11 photo shoot with many celebrities, including Jonathan Taylor Thomas, Nicholas Turturro, Lawrence Taylor, Pamela Anderson, and Jenny McCarthy. Hall also made an appearance, as Razor Ramon, on an episode of The Jerry Springer Show. After defeating Jeff Jarrett at a house show in May of '95 to pick up his record-setting third Intercontinental Championship, Hall would claim a fourth IC title by the end of '95, a record he would hold for 4 years. And that was probably not even Hall's biggest accomplishment that year, as he and his wife gave birth to their daughter Cassidy in 1995. Hall was originally penciled in to face Goldust in a Miami street fight for the Intercontinental title at WrestleMania 12, but it was around this time that his inner demon started getting the best of him, and he was suspended for 6 weeks due to drug use. As I mentioned earlier, he formed a group in the locker room known as the Clique, along with Sean Waltman, Kevin Nash, Shawn Michaels, and Paul Levesque, otherwise known as Triple H. Once Hall and Nash had given their official notice to the company in the spring of '96, the group had their final swan song at a house show in Madison Square Garden, embracing in a group hug, which was unusual at the time for heels and babyfaces, mid-carders and main eventers to engage in such an activity. It was one of the first times in front of a live audience that the word kayfabe felt non-existent. Later on, Hall stated that he opted to leave for WCW not for the money, but because they offered him days off. Hall returned to WCW and made his on-screen debut on an episode of Monday Nitro under his real name, which again was rather unusual at the time. He also cut what seemed to be a promo deviating from the regular script, or a shoot promo within the confines of a work setting. It was very odd yet very intriguing at the same time. And weeks later, when Hall was joined by his friend Kevin Nash, also his real name, the duo were known as the Outsiders, and were presented as rebels who had apparently been sent by Vince McMahon to destroy WCW from within. That was all kayfabe, of course, but once Hulk Hogan was introduced as the leader of this new faction, things started becoming a little clearer. The popularity of the now NWO grew with each passing week, and it definitely changed the game and especially how fans view pro wrestling, considering that the bad guys were now being cheered as good guys. The fact that Scott Hall was the first piece of that puzzle to fall into place is a rather huge accomplishment. That's a huge chunk of history right there, and this storyline was one of the major reasons that Nitro beat Raw in the television ratings for 83 weeks. Hall was also notorious for having creative ideas. He actually inspired the change in Sting's character as well, from the bleach blonde surfer dude to the dark and disturbed Crow character that he's portrayed for the majority of his career up until this very day. But not everything Hall did was for the greater good. He was also largely responsible for the fall of Bill Goldberg. Goldberg's first career loss was to Hall's buddy Kevin Nash at Starrcade '98 after being stunned with a taser by Hall, who was posing as a security guard. Many claim that this is the event that led WCW into a downward spiral, culminating in their ultimate demise in 2001. In the years that followed, several career injuries ended up costing Hall titles, each of which he was forced to vacate, and also prevented him from climbing any higher up the ladder of success. As a fan, though, I was mostly disappointed and somewhat embarrassed when WCW decided to exploit Hall's history of alcohol abuse problems and use it as part of a storyline in a feud with Kevin Nash in '98. The bad times continued for the bad guy both on and off screen as he and Dana Lee divorced in '98 due to Hall's drug use. The couple remarried in '99 but divorced again in 2001. After returning from an injury in late '99, Hall had one last run in WCW as part of the NWO 2000 faction, along with Kevin Nash, Bret Hart, Jeff Jarrett, and Scott Steiner. But this group didn't last too long after Bret's career-ending injury sustained in a match with Bill Goldberg. Hall's last appearance in WCW was in a World Championship three-way match with Sid Vicious and Jeff Jarrett at Super Brawl 2000. From there, he made a few surprise appearances in ECW at the end of 2000 before returning to New Japan in 2001, joining the Team 2000 stable. He wrestled there until September 2001 when he wrestled his final match for the promotion for the Triple Crown World Heavyweight Championship against Keiji Muto. Hall returned to the WWF in February 2002 at the No Way Out pay-per-view, reunited with his longtime partners Hollywood Hogan and Kevin Nash as yet another new version of the NWO. He wrestled in one of the featured bouts of that year's WrestleMania against one of the WWF's hottest stars, Stone Cold Steve Austin, and while he lost the match, I thought he had a decent one and did a fantastic job of selling the Stone Cold Stunner. This run in the WWF didn't last too long, as Hall's inner demons had returned for a visit. This time as he was on a flight back from England returning after the Insurrection pay-per-view, a flight now appropriately dubbed the Plane Ride from Hell, Hall and several others engaged in various acts of sexual misconduct while on board. In Hall's case, he was described as being extremely intoxicated and allegedly sexually assaulted one of the flight attendants on board, supposedly licking her face and making sexual remarks. Hall was one of the talents released in the days that followed. After his WWE departure, he did wrestle briefly for TNA between 2002 and 2007. He made an appearance on their first pay-per-view in June 2002. In 2004, he teamed with Jeff Jarrett and Kevin Nash to take on the team of AJ Styles, Jeff Hardy, and Randy Savage, who had just come out of retirement for this one match after not having wrestled for 5 years. Hall also married his second wife Jessica Hart in 2006, and they divorced about a year later. Hall was scheduled to team with Samoa Joe and Kevin Nash for a 6-man tag at a pay-per-view in December 2007, but he no-showed the event, which led to a shoot promo by Joe on live TV, openly expressing his own anger and frustration about the whole situation. Despite all of this, Hall was brought back to the company by Hulk Hogan and Eric Bischoff in 2010. He wrestled very infrequently and was eventually cut from the promotion due to his ongoing legal problems. This is around the time that he announced his retirement from professional wrestling in the summer of 2010. Between TNA runs, he also briefly wrestled for Juggalo Championship Wrestling and returned to World Wrestling Council as Razor Ramon. After his TNA release in 2010, Hall checked into a rehab facility paid for by the WWE. He had a defibrillator and pacemaker implanted into his chest and was hospitalized twice in 2010 for double pneumonia. During this time, Hall started having seizures and was diagnosed with epilepsy. He was required as a result to take 11 different medications daily to treat his heart and seizure problems. He was in and out of the hospital in the years that followed due to various cardiac issues. In 2013, Hall was invited into the home of his former colleague and longtime friend Diamond Dallas Page to help stay sober and rebuild his life from the ground up, mentally, physically, professionally, and spiritually. Hall was brought back to the WWE in 2014 under a Legends contract following his Hall of Fame induction at that year's WrestleMania. His last televised appearance was at last year's WrestleMania, inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame once again as a member of the New World Order. Hall was loved by wrestling fans worldwide without question, but many of those fans unfortunately didn't know a whole lot about Scott Hall the individual. He had a long history of legal problems. In 1983, he was charged with second-degree murder after shooting a man in the head with his own gun in an altercation outside of an Orlando nightclub in self-defense. The case was eventually thrown out due to lack of evidence. In 1998, Hall was arrested for groping a 56-year-old woman outside of a hotel in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Hall was also arrested in 2008 during a roast of the Iron Sheik when comedian Jimmy Graham made an insensitive joke about the death of Owen Hart, causing Hall to storm the stage and yell that the joke was disrespectful. Graham later said that Hall was drunk at the time of the attack. On April 6, 2012, Hall was also arrested for an incident described as domestic disturbance involving his girlfriend Lisa Howell. Hall allegedly choked Howell while drunk. Hall denied the allegations and the case was dismissed due to insufficient evidence. In March 2022, Hall was again hospitalized after falling and breaking his hip. He was on the floor immobile for days before finally being discovered by Diamond Dallas Page during a wellness check, and Page took him to the hospital. After Hall underwent hip replacement surgery, a blood clot was dislodged, causing 3 heart attacks on March 12th, after which he was placed on a life support at Wellstar Kenstone Hospital in Marietta, Georgia. He was taken off life support on March 14th, and his death was announced later that day. Sean Waltman spoke with the Wrestling Observer a few days later, stating that Hall had fallen back into alcohol abuse when the COVID-19 pandemic and resulting lockdowns prevented him from having any social interactions. Scott Hall will forever be one of the greatest of all time. He was one of the coolest wrestling figures from many of our childhoods, and someone that we would often imitate. I'm sure a lot of us can probably relate to his history of legal or substance abuse problems, and I definitely urge those who are dealing with or know someone dealing with similar circumstances to find someone that they can talk to. Sometimes that can make a world of difference. I can't imagine what Scott Hall's family must have gone through, but I wish them nothing but the best and express my most heartfelt condolences to those who were most affected by his passing. I do think it's important to remember all the good times as fans of Scott Hall or Razor Ramon or the Diamond Stud, whatever the case may be, and think about the impact that he's had on our lives as wrestling fans and the impact that he's had on the business in general. So with that, I'm going to end this episode with the very words that I started with. Hard work pays off, dreams come true, bad times don't last, but bad guys do.